We all know Santa's origin story. He's based on the historical St. Nicholas of Myra, who in turn inspired the Dutch Sinterklaas, who after arriving in North America was redubbed Santa Claus, who in the mid-19th century effectively merged with the British figure of Father Christmas, the latter being a personification of Christmas, not a representation of the aforementioned saint. Add a few splashes of Coca-Cola and voila, we have our modern Santa Claus. Of course, some would argue that the figure of Santa Claus actually predates St. Nicholas and even Christmas itself, going back to the days of Yule. In Norse mythology, Odin, the Allfather, is depicted as Father Yule. He's a long-bearded deity who flies around on an 8-legged steed and doles out gifts to the deserving. Oh, and one of his nicknames, Yulnir, the Yule One, might have given us the word jolly in English by way of the French jolie, but that's still up for debate. Regardless, there are some obvious parallels between Odin and Santa Claus, and more broadly Yule and Christmas, that many people have pointed out before. But what about Odin's Celtic counterparts? Specifically, there's the Dagda from Irish mythology, who also goes by the name Eochaid Allathair, All-Father, and there's Succulus, who was worshipped in Gaul and beyond. Given that all three of these gods, the Norse Odin, the Irish Dagda, and the Gaulish Succulus, likely evolved from the same Proto-Indo-European figure, it got me wondering, might we find traces of the ancient Celtic gods in our modern Santa Claus in the same way we find traces of the Norse god Odin? The short answer, yes. The longer answer, I found so much more than I bargained for. Let me get right down to it. The Dagda, the father of the Tua de Danann, the Irish gods, is described as wielding a great club or staff known as the Lorgmor, and he possesses a cauldron that no one ever goes away from hungry. Succulus, meanwhile, is thought to be a god of agriculture and is often depicted wielding a great hammer or mallet in one hand and in the other an olla, which is a jar or barrel for cooking and storing food. Then we have St. Nicholas, who is often depicted with his bishop's crozier standing next to a barrel for curing food. Only according to legend, or hagiography as it were, the food in the aforementioned barrel is a trio of pickled children, whom St. Nicholas dutifully resurrects. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, resurrecting people in a cooking vessel? That sounds super Celtic. Well, it's possible you read the Mabinogion, the earliest prose stories written in Welsh, stories that are rooted in pre-Christian Brittonic Celtic mythology. Specifically, in the tale Branwen Ferch Lir, the British king Bran the Blessed gifts the Per de Dini, Cauldron of Rebirth, to the Irish king Matholwich, who famously chucks his dead warriors into the cauldron to revive them. So what does any of this have to do with Santa Claus? Here's the deal. The cauldron is a symbol. The olla and the barrel are symbols. They're all symbols of life and abundance. Of course, old St. Nick would have been none too jolly if he had to lug a cauldron or barrel around with him, so it's possible the old symbols evolved in the popular imagination into a more portable symbol of abundance. Santa's sack, a magical bag that no one ever goes away from wanting more. Now, wait just a minute, I can hear some of you shouting. St. Nicholas lived in what is now Turkey. How the heck could there have been any Celtic influence on the story of his life? Two things to consider. First, let's look at the map. There were Celts in what is now Turkey perhaps as early as the 3rd century BCE. These were the Galatians who branched off from the Gaulish Celts, and it's possible they brought this shared Proto-Celtic concept of a cauldron of life or abundance with them, where it was then later absorbed into the St. Nicholas mythos. Because here's the second thing. St. Nicholas is said to have lived from 270 to 343 CE, but the first written accounts of his life don't show up until 5 centuries later, and not surprisingly, they're full of embellishments and conflations. Specifically, the story of St. Nick's signature charitable giving seems to be lifted from the life of Apollonius of Tyana, which was written in the 3rd century CE but concerns itself with the wonder workings of a 1st century CE Neo-Pythagorean philosopher. To quote historian Jonah Lendering, it is not unusual that a Christian saint adorns himself with stories that belong to the pagan cults. End quote. Perhaps the story of a restorative barrel or cauldron is another such example of Christianity taking a page out of the pagan playbook. So far we've found some potentially Celtic fingerprints on the character of Santa Claus, but certainly no definitive link to a Celtic god. Let's see if we can change that. Because the closer we look at the Dagda, the Irish Allfather, the one with the bottomless cauldron that, quote, no company ever went away from unsatisfied, end quote, the more parallels to Kris Kringle we find. For starters, his appearance. He's a giant, or at the very least, a very large man, with a beard and a hooded cloak. The historian Peter Beresford Ellis describes the Dagda's garb as rustic, and he also explains that during the Second Battle of Moytura, as described in the text, the Cath Magtura, the Dagda adopts a new persona, that of Ruad Rofessa, which allegedly translates to something like Lord of Great Knowledge, but one can't help but notice that Ruad is the old Irish word for red. Turns out this is probably a red herring, because even in the guise of Ruad Rofessa, the Dagda Dagda does not actually dress in red, and of course in the earliest depictions of Santa Claus, he's not in red either. According to author Mark L. Long, it was the artist Thomas Nast who, quote, changed the color of Santa's coat from tan to the traditional red that we see today. End quote. Keep that in mind as you read this description of the Dagda per the Kathmag Turret. Quote, his belly was as big as a house cauldron, and the Fomorians laughed at it. It was not easy for the warrior to move along on account of the size of his belly. His appearance was unsightly. He had a cape to the hollow of his elbows and a gray-brown tunic around him as far as the swelling of his rump. He had on 2 shoes of horsehide with the hair outside. End quote. And it's not just the brown outfit and big belly that give off Proto-Santa vibes, it's the Dagda's character and personality. Yes, he's incredibly powerful, but he's also jovial and silly. The word that almost always comes up when people describe him is jolly. Case in point, the whole reason the Dagda's belly gets so supernaturally engorged in the first place is because the Fomorians tried to mock him by offering him porridge, as they know his, quote, love of porridge was great, end quote. So they bring out this massive cauldron, and what's the very first thing they pour into it? Quote, 80 gallons of new milk. End quote. Then they add meal and fat and goats and sheep and swine and boil it all up, but instead of scoffing at this concoction, the Dagda eats the whole freaking thing, just to have a laugh and beat them at their own game. Shortly after that, there's this scene where the Dagda's trying to make love, but he's too full and his belly's just too big, and it's all just very playful and silly. Also, much earlier in the text, there's a story about the Dagda having to give up the 3 biggest portions of all of his meals, so he loses a bunch of weight, and when his son Angus, aka the Macog, sees him, he's like, hey, why do you look so awful? So there's this expectation around the Dagda that he should always have a big belly. And unlike the other gods, as Ellis notes, he's allowed to have a big belly. He doesn't keep his pristine form as the other members of the Tua de Danann seem to do. His weight fluctuates and he ages just like a human, his great beard inevitably turning white as winter snow. Oh, and did I mention that Dagda has a, quote, house in the north? It's called Glen Eden, Eden meaning the place of pleasure. Finally, as the god of druids in Druidism, the Dagda is also a sort of judge. That's what historical druids actually were, mind you, not sorcerers or fortune tellers, but arbiters of peace and justice, as well as scientists and philosophers and royal advisors. Now, it's doubtful the Dagda drew up naughty and nice lists, but he does take the druid as judge concept to a supernatural extreme, given that he is the wielder of the Lorgmore, one end of which can slay 9 people with a single blow, and the other end of which can restore life with a single touch. And this leads me to one final avenue of exploration: the Holly King and the Oak King. The ancient Celts only observed 2 seasons, winter and summer. The Holly King and the Oak King are personifications of those 2 seasons. The Holly King is said to come into power on Samhain, but he's at his most powerful in midwinter. The Oak King, meanwhile, comes into power on Beltane, the Celtic May Day, but he's at his most powerful in midsummer. A quick caveat: we're stepping outside of the realm of mythology here in discussing the Holly King and the Oak King because they are essentially neo-pagan concepts that have been applied retroactively to figures across different storytelling traditions. For example, it's been posited that in Arthurian legend, the Green Knight is a representation of the Holly King, and Sir Gawain is a representation of the Oak King. Within Welsh mythology, Grand Pibre has been interpreted as the Holly King, and Lugh La Gifts the Oak King. And within Irish mythology, Baelor of the Evil Eye is sometimes seen as a really scary version of the Holly King, and his grandson Lugh is sometimes seen as a version of the Oak King. The common thread in these stories is that the 2 figures are locked in battle until one kills or beheads the other, signaling that summer has overtaken winter or vice versa. And while the claim has been made that the Holly King, a personification of winter, directly inspired the British figure of Father Christmas, who, as you'll remember, developed independently of the St. Nicholas tradition, it is strange that all of the Holly King examples I've encountered are antagonists, because that doesn't really jive with what we know about Father Christmas, who, in his earliest appearances, is associated with feasting and merrymaking. One way to resolve this issue is to think of the Holly King and Oak King not as 2 distinct figures, but as 2 warring personalities stuck within the same figure. Folklorist and anthropologist James George Fraser referred to this figure as the Divine King, a figure that had within him the essences of both summer and winter, who wielded the powers of life and death. Sound familiar? It's the Dagda, or rather, he's one manifestation of this archetype, a log-swinging oak of a god who also happens to be in the business of chopping down oaks. To quote the Divine King himself, "I will be a giant oak in every ford and in every pass you will cross, and the mark of my axe will remain in every oak forever." End quote. But what about Santa's elves? This one is simple. The Irish gods, the Tua de Danann, are the elves, or rather, they become them. As I explored in my previous video, the Tuatha Dé Danann are renowned for and possibly named for their superior craftsmanship. So much so that they inspired Tolkien's elves from The Lord of the Rings, who, like their mythical Irish counterparts, famously make and wield some serious toys. Unlike Tolkien's elves, however, who sail off into the sunset, when the Age of Men catches up to the Tuatha Dé Danann with the arrival of the invading Milesians to represent the arrival of Celtic culture in Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann are driven underground where they shrink both literally and figuratively. To quote Irish poet W.B. Yeats's Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, the pagan gods of Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann, robbed of worship and offerings, grew smaller and smaller in the popular imagination until they turned into the fairies. End quote. One of those fairies, of course, is the Leprechaun, and you've also got your Chloricons, both of which are known for cobbling shoes and, especially with the former, granting wishes and hiding big crocks or cauldrons of treasure. And while modern depictions of leprechauns almost always see them in some type of green garb, in earlier iterations of the diminutive fairies, red was their signature color. To quote scholar David Russell McNally's Irish Wonders, the ghosts, giants, pukas, demons, leprechauns, banshees, fairies, witches, widows, old maids, and other marvels of the Emerald Isle, the northern leprechaun, or Lograman, wore a military red coat and white breeches. The Lorigadon of Tipperary wore an antique slashed jacket of red with peaks all around. The Luricon of Kerry was a fat, pursy little fellow whose jolly round face rivals in redness the cutaway jacket he wears. The Chloricon of Monaghan wore a swallow-tailed evening coat of red with green vest. End quote. You wanted some Celtic elves for our Celtic Santa? Ladies and gentlemen, I give you leprechauns. If you enjoyed this video, please like and comment and tap all of the little buttons, and by the end of it, make sure you are subscribed to the Irish Myths channel. That really helps. And if you want to learn more about potential Celtic connections to our favorite midwinter traditions, check out the very first video I made for this channel, the Celtic Origins of Kissing Under the Mistletoe at Christmas. Boy, is it rough, but hey, I had to start somewhere. My name is I.E. Neverday, editor of the short story collection Neon Druid and creator of IrishMyths.com. Thanks for coming out. Ho, ho, ho. Now I have the Lorgmore.